After the Civil War, the northern states further industrialized, and the city became the embodiment of modern America. Memphis represented the juncture of northern modernity and rural southern traditions. A prosperous black community and the effort of whites to retain power, coupled with fluctuation in population size and commercial success, made the development of the city unique. One characteristic that emphasized Memphis's hold on the Southern values is the many cases of racial tensions that often ended in violence. One perfect example of this is the Memphis Massacre of 1866, a year after the Civil War. The riots sparked by the dwelling dislike over the liberation of African Americans. The riots targeted the African Americans community, which suffered a combination of murders, rape, and vandalism. By the end of the riots, a reported 4 churches, 12 schools, and overall 91 dwellings were burned, and an estimated 46 African Americans were killed, making it one of the biggest race riots in American history. The race riots were led by white Memphians. Many of those were Irish immigrants or descendants of immigrants who were previously seen as an outsider group by white Americans. But in those days, having white skin made easy for them to integrate to the South by antagonizing African Americans. They maintained their Irish culture while accepting their American lives, something that their color of their skin allowed them to do. Their dislike of African Americans stems from even before the war, as they would lose many jobs to slave black men. However, their misguided hatred was tamed by the plantation owners. After the emancipation, this hatred peaked as Irish Americans represented competing with newly freed African Americans. This hatred often resulted in violent crimes. On May 1st, 1866, the mostly Irish police found themselves in a confrontation with black ex-soldiers who had been drinking. This confrontation would result in gunfire and spark the riot that lasted 3 days. The events of the riots were justified by the conservative groups of the South and eventually set as a status quo for groups such as the Ku Klux Klan to infiltrate Memphis. Their interpretation saw horrific violence as necessary. They used this as an example of the failures of Reconstruction and the emancipation. They see freed African Americans as dangerous. The retaliation to this fear of freed African Americans were those riots. The poor response to the riots proved that Memphis, just like much of the South, still did not see African Americans as equals. This divide within the city of Memphis wasn't the only thing that kept from becoming the South's sparks of industrialization. Even after the riots, Memphis had a population of 40,000 people, double that of Nashville and Atlanta. The only southern city bigger than Memphis was New Orleans. Train lines rumbled the city. Cotton was still the driving industry for Memphis. People walked among the crates of cottons along its main streets. However, the city would be hit with the yellow fever epidemic, which gave Memphis the label of a dirty and disease-heavy city. The epidemic became another setback in the transition of Memphis from a rural southern town into the city it was meant to become. No other city was hit by the yellow fever as hard as Memphis, with approximately 7,000 deaths. Following the yellow fever epidemics of the 1870s, Memphis was hit with a $100 million setback, loss of population, and disruption of urban life, causing the city to lose momentum for New South development, the human and capital resources needed to sustain it, and the confidence of outside investors. Those who were part of the white flight movement began to return to Memphis. The problem, though, was that after whites left the city, the majority population became African American. The returning whites immediately felt the need to reassert the dominant whiteness that held Memphis. To do this, they revoked the city's charter and established a commission government. In doing so, power was concentrated back into the hands of upper-class white males and limited the influence of African American and minority voters for decades to come by shifting from local to county-wide elections. However, this new concentration of power led to no productivity or assistance from the local government and instead fell into the hands of the federal government. Furthermore, these white officials attempted to use African American people as a scapegoat for the city's ongoing debt accumulation. Therefore, during this time of this new government and following the reestablishment of Memphis as a city in 1891, Memphis regressed and a negative image of it was painted. To create a more positive image, the city underwent reforms to make Memphis a place of respect and prominence. These changes emphasized the importance of a healthy environment, beautiful landscapes, and public spaces, which led to the emergence of a new movement. Although not originally planned, the 19th Century Club took up the fight for a better Memphis. Established in 1890, the club was composed entirely of women. Its intended purpose was to promote the female intellect by encouraging a spirit of research in literary fields and provide an intellectual center for the women of Memphis. However, by 1900, the club moved towards a more civic than intellectual route. The idea was to use their platform to help create a better society to live in, hence their motto, "Influence is responsibility." The club focused on the needs of women and children and addressed problems in areas such as sanitation, health, education, employment, and labor conditions. This club helped to create more female jobs in fields typically for men, such as health inspection and law enforcement, helped establish the University of Memphis, and created a clean government campaign. This campaign, as the name highlights, focused on government reform. Law violations, corruption, as well as gambling and prostitution were issues tackled to create a new and improved government. The club's influence spread and led to the creation of a citywide women's council and ultimately a statewide Tennessee Federation of Women's Clubs, which expanded on the focuses of the 19th Century Club. The women of the Federation strived for better homes, schools, lives, surroundings, scholarship, civic health, and righteousness, the conservation of forests and places of natural beauty, and protection for unfortunate children and women laborers. Change in Memphis corresponded to the growth of private industries, capital investment, and population. By 1890, investment in manufacturing was at $9 million. The value of trade was at $200 million, and by 1900, the population was at 102,320. Memphis was regaining its financial status, and with its exceeding population of over 100,000, it established itself as a city. The early success in Memphis and its recognition as a city was attributed to its population, which was half white and half black, and immigration that brought Irish, Germans, French, Italian, Greeks, and Chinese. According to the national census in 1900, Memphis was proclaimed as one of the largest cities in the South. With the population consisting of blacks and other European backgrounds, there was racial tension between these groups and whites. They saw the large presence of African Americans in Memphis as a threat to white supremacy. The new immigrants from the south of Europe also faced persecution in the South because of their darker skin. Eventually, the European immigrants were accepted as whites, while the black population still faced discrimination. In 1899, blacks were still not allowed to attend public theaters or parks in Memphis. The segregation forced African Americans to work separately and open their own businesses. In 1901, Robert Reed Church Sr. opened Church's Park and Auditorium for African American performers and audience members. The auditorium cost somewhere between $50,000 to $80,000 and was able to sit 2,200 people. During the grand opening of this new theater, despite class and color differences, it became a place of solidarity for people of different social classes and was recognized as a first of its kind, a colored vaudeville house. Robert Church not only opened the first colored theater in Memphis, but he also established Beale Street by owning several saloons and other businesses. Beale Street was the most known celebrated street in Memphis within the black community. The street extended up to a mile eastward from the Mississippi River and was lined up with commercial buildings, churches, theaters, parks, mansions, and apartments. In 1908 and 1909, more African American theaters emerged in Memphis, allowing for business and entertainment opportunities for people of color. At the turn of the century, Memphis was considered a refuge for black Southerners escaping the racially motivated limits enforced in the rural South. While Memphis was not free of this problem, By the 1910s, African Americans in Memphis enjoyed a prosperous middle class composed of professionals and entrepreneurs. As a whole, Memphis resembled a northern city. It had several hospitals, colleges, paved roads, and a sizable downtown. For African Americans, Beale Street was the embodiment of black political, cultural, and social autonomy. It was the home to black-owned banks, restaurants, and public amusements such as dance halls, saloons, and vaudevilles. Memphis was responsible for inspiring the songs Beale Street Blues and Memphis Blues that introduced the genre to the world. Furthermore, in 1916, the Lincoln League was founded to promote African American involvement in electoral politics. Unfortunately, the accomplishments of black Memphians and the continued urbanization of Memphis, with its perceived moral degradation, further blurred the color lines of Jim Crow and was a threat to Southern white power and traditions. African American lawyers, doctors, and other professionals were constantly targeted by white vigilantes who feared the rise of black supremacy. It was in this context that in 1917, when a teenage white girl was brutally murdered, white Memphians wasted no time in inciting racial tensions and blamed an innocent black man named L. Persons for the murder. The fear-mongering culminated in the first recorded lynching in over 20 years. The lynching sparked a movement led by Robert Church Jr., son of the first African-American millionaire and Memphis proprietor. Memphis established an NAACP chapter, in one of the first in the South. Church Jr. went on to help establish 68 branches in 14 southern states and led a national campaign against lynching for the years to come. From 1865 to 1920, Memphis was marred with racial violence and resistance to black progress, widespread disease, and even the loss of the city's charter. Nonetheless, Memphis recovered and stepped into the 20th century as a culturally and economically important southern city.